Hello, friend. My name is Derek Carter, and in this video, we're going to finish up the chapter on sequences. We've only got a little bit more to look at. We'll quickly talk about tuples, which we've already mentioned are immutable versions of sequences that Python offers. We'll talk about how to use those and why they have an immutable sequence. And then we're going to look at the chapter in our textbook finishes up with some examples of plotting using the Matplotlib library. So the reason why that's in there is because most of the plots that Matplotlib takes a sequence or two sequences to specify the elements that are going to be on the plot. So we'll look at that, but I mean, just in general, learning a bit about the plotting library is a useful skill to have. So you can generate plots for reports and figures and things. Okay, if you're ready, that's it. Let's go ahead and get started. So there's not a whole lot more to say about tuples. The tuple is basically the immutable version of a sequence that Python offers. So really everything that we talked about for the list in the previous two videos, well, I shouldn't say that. I mean, many things that we talked about in terms of generally for sequence, for lists, apply to a tuple. So the only thing that doesn't apply are anything that are in that mutable that make, that change the sequence. So all of the mutable member methods like appending, inserting a new item, those aren't available in a tuple. So those aren't implemented for a tuple. And you can't modify a particular element, but you can, slice a tuple, you can actually index it. So a tuple is a mutable sequence, which means that its contents cannot change. So basically, round parentheses instead of square brackets are used whenever you're specifying a tuple. Okay, so it supports any of those methods that we talked about, including built-in methods like length, min, max, and any of the member methods that don't actually modify. They don't add new elements or remove elements or things like that. Okay, so tuples don't support the append, remove, insert, can't reverse, and so on. So you might first wonder, okay, why is there even a tuple at all? Well, they can be a bit faster, but that's not really the main reason. There are some operations that require an immutable sequence, an immutable list of values. So just as a quick example, you have to use an immutable sequence for the keys in a dictionary, which is another type of container we're going to talk about in a little bit. And there's other situations like that where you really can't use something that can be modified as your sequence of items in different areas. So let's just look at a few examples then of creating a tuple and then using them here. So just as a basic example, let's call it a tuple T. So if we use parentheses, we'll end up with a tuple type, right? And like I was saying, you can do any of the things that we talked about before for a list. You can index it, you can negative index it, so get the last element out of it. You can take slices, element 1 and 2, 1 up to, but not including 3. So the only difference between that and a list to create that was for a list you use the square brackets. In that case, you'll get a list. So since a tuple is immutable, we can't modify it. For like a list, I could change the item, any of the items to be something else. If you try to do that with a tuple, it'll throw an exception. So if I change the item at index 0 in the tuple, we get a type error that doesn't support assignment. So if you want to, you can look at the methods that are part of a tuple here. So it's quite reduced. So you just get the count and the index. So a lot of the member methods that we talked about before do mutate the list. So you don't have any of those things like append, remove, insert, that kind of stuff. But you do have a lot of the built-ins still. So you can ask the length of a tuple. You can use min and max on tuples to find the min value or the max value. You can use repetition and concatenation, so you can repeat a tuple. So this creates a new tuple with the items for the original tuple repeated multiple times. Sometimes you need to create a tuple with a single item. There's a bit of a syntax problem, so you might think that is how you create a tuple with a single item, but really, so the problem here is that this gets evaluated as a mathematical expression. It just looks like an expression with a parentheses and just a 1 in there, right? So if you look at t, it's really just an integer when I just did that. So if I need to define a tuple of a single item, so initialize it with a single item, you have to do a little bit of a kludgy kind of thing, but put like a 1 comma. And then you'll get a tuple, just a single item in that. Okay? And you can create a tuple, an empty tuple, and sometimes you might need that. And actually, there's no problem with this. But the reason why is this can't be parsed as an arithmetic expression. There has to be at least some value in there, an integer or a variable that has an integer or float in it. So you'll end up. Python will interpret that as just a tuple of no items, the same as like you create an empty list. So in both cases, the length of those are 0. Okay. So a final thing about tuples here, sometimes you might need to convert a tuple to a list or vice versa. So there is the list built-in method and the tuple built-in method. So most of the data types, I haven't mentioned this before, have built-in methods, and if you give them something, they'll try and convert the thing you give them into the type you ask for. So if you give a string to this method, it'll try and convert that to an integer type and so on. So if I have a list of items like L, and I need to make that into a tuple, we can just use the tuple method. So that will take the sequence L and create a new tuple with the items in the sequence into the tuple T. Okay. And just as a final note, our textbook doesn't discuss this, but you can also pass tuples into functions and return them from functions. There's not a lot of difference of passing a tuple or a list into a function, since a lot of times you don't really actually modify. You don't want to modify the sequence that you're passing in, right? And also, it's really actually more common to return a tuple from a function. So if you need to return multiple values, we talked a little bit about this when we talked about functions, but if you need to return multiple values, you're normally returning just a tuple from a function. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the Matplotlib library. So this is another package or Python library that you can use, but it's not part of the standard Python library. So as our textbook mentions, you need to do a pip install after you install Python in order to use the Matplotlib library. So if you haven't installed any additional libraries or packages that aren't part of standard Python, you might want to figure out how to do that now, because you will need to install some other things later on in the course to do stuff for assignments and things. So we'll show in a bit here. So conventionally we import Matplotlib. We haven't shown alternative ways of using this import statement. So what this does is this imports a sub module of Matplotlib called pyplot, which has a version of the API for creating plots here. And this is what most people use this version. It's a more object-oriented way of performing plots. We just import that into the namespace called PLT. So you'll see that conventionally used this a lot. I recommend people use this consult the Matplot documentation here. I'll put this documentation in the comments for the video, or if you have these slides, you can get it from there. So here's the Matplotlib documentation. I believe this is the So if you click on the link I gave you, it'll just take you to the most recent stable version of the documentation. So there's probably different ways to get here, but so for example, probably if you go to the API reference, so yeah, I'd probably just jump right to the Matplotlib PyPlot to get like a high level overview of the different thing. So in particular, we're going to look at the basic plot to plot an XY set of lines, but there's lots of plots. We're going to look at plotting and a bar plot and a pie plot, but there's scatter plots, semi-log and log-log plots, horizontal bar plots, stacked plots, polar plots, contour plots, and lots of other stuff there. So you can look around here and get more information about all the available things for plotting. So a word about installing packages, if I haven't mentioned this before. So if you were using the recommended method for getting Python into your system for our class, you would have just installed the basic distribution provided by python.org. So you'd probably want to use the pip package manager. If you installed something else like using Conda or some other distribution, you might have to figure out how to use the package manager to get different packages that aren't part of the standard Python library. So you can always check if you have something by running your interpreter, and I can check whether I have it or not. So if you don't have it, you'll have to do like a pip install, or you'll have to figure out whatever you're using for your Python distribution, how you install new packages. So on like Linux or Mac OS systems, if you're using the standard Python, you probably can do like a pip3 install. On Windows, you don't have the sudo command, and you may or may not have pip. So pip3 is just version 3 of Python. But on Windows, I think they just by default only have Python and pip a lot of times. So try it either way. So I think that this would work on my system here. So yeah, I mean, that basically works on my system using the sudo pip3 install. So, once you do that, if you go back in, the import should work. And like I said on the slide, that conventionally, the way we normally use what's called the PyPlot, which is a alternative API for plotting that Matplotlib gives. So we normally do that. So now we've actually imported all of the PyPlot API into a namespace called plot. So again, you can use the directory command to see everything that's in there. So this will have the stuff we're going to work with. So this will have the basic plot. This will have bar for creating bar charts and pie for creating pie charts. Okay. So to create basic line graphs, you can use the plot function. So plot is probably the most basic function PyPlot, Matplotlib Library provides. So, what it does essentially is you have to pass it two lists or two sequences. Now, these sequences have to be of the same length, right? So these are paired up, XY pairs. So it's going to plot a point at 0, 0, at 1, 3, at 2, 1, and so on. So, and if you're doing real plotting, you wouldn't normally kind of create your X and Y points by hand. You'd be doing something to generate a plot into a list of X points and the corresponding Y points. And then you would be calling plot to plot these like this. So I'll just jump right to there's a couple of versions of plotting a line graph. So I'll jump to the last version, which kind of shows a couple of the features of things. So again, in the script, we import it like this. So we have the PyPlot interface in the namespace PLT. You might need to add in some things to set the fig size and the font size. These will depend on your resolution for your monitor and stuff like that in order for this to be to look okay when you run these plots here. And when you're running these things in interactive way like this, like from a script from a command line, you do need to have like a final show here to actually pop up the window and show it. So we're basically doing the same plot, although we've added a couple stuff. So you know, you might need to change the line width again for to look good, depending on your screen resolution stuff. The final version of this showed adding some markers on some things, and I had to add this in order for these to be more visible when I plot this up here. We're adding on labels to the x-axis and the y-axis, and we're changing the tick marks on the x-axis and the y-axis for this plot here, and adding in the grid and stuff. So, when you add in all those features, it looks something like this. Anyway, there's the figure. I'm gonna have to switch back and forth between these, I guess, in my using this streaming software here. So, but yeah, that plot I was looking for before has these elements, with the settings that we showed. They should be in the repository when I commit these things and push them up for the 233 class repository. Okay, so and the bar chart is the second chart type that our textbook shows for the Matplotlib. So in this case, again, it takes two lists, or two sequences actually. The first one is the location where the bar should go, and then the second one is the height of the bar that's going to be drawn. So for drawing vertical bar plots, kind of the simplest would be something like this, where I'm centering these and plotting the heights from 100 to 500 here for 5 different bars that we have. So one note, the textbook shows, actually let me bring up the code here and I'll discuss that. So here's the third version of the bar chart figure that the textbook shows. So actually, if you use edges 0, 10, 20, 30, 40 on these examples, the default alignment has changed from left edge to centering. So to get the same effect the textbook has, you have to actually add in an align equals edge to the bar. Also, there's no default color around like is shown, so you have to add in an edge color. But otherwise, this is mostly the same, I think, as what the textbook showed on the final version here. So we're passing in two lists in this case, so the location of the left edge for the bar chart and the height for them. And then we're setting, most of these are similar to what we set before, but this does illustrate you can actually set the tick marks to be something other than numbers. So we set years and dollars in millions of dollars, I guess, for sales here for this example. So if you run that script, you should get something that looks like this. This here, so you can no longer really tell with left edge or center edge, but these are left edge, but we've changed the labels on the X ticks and the Y ticks marks, and we've labeled the X axis and the Y axis and have title and everything nice and neat on here. And finally, let's just show the example of the pie chart plot that our textbook used. So like I mentioned, there's many more different kinds of plotting, basic plots that you can do with Matplotlib. So the pie chart only takes a single list, which is just going to be the amount of sales, and it sums that up in order to figure out the percentage or the area for each of the wedges in the pie there. And then there's similar stuff. You can have titles. You can label each one of the wedges by passing in a list. So we are actually passing in two lists here. Just notice that went a little bit over the edge here, but our second list is going to be the label. So again, if you're doing something like this, the number of labels has to match the number of wedges that you're creating in your pie chart here. So it's basically the same as in the textbook, although again, I had to modify the size and the font size a little bit to make it a little bit more viewable on my screen. But we have the sales amounts, 4 different sales amounts, and we're labeling them as first, second, third, fourth quarter. So we're actually passing in two sequences, two lists in this case, to our pie chart when we draw this up here. So what we get is something that looks like this. So this is our pie chart labeled for second, third, fourth quarter. By default, it uses colors and a standard rotation here on a pie chart. But that's another thing you can specify is what color for each of the wedges and other stuff like that. Okay, so with that, that's all we had for this video. So we covered two slightly separate topics. We finished up talking about sequences by looking at a tuple. So the thing you ought to know at this point in the class is that a tuple is the mutable sequence. So most of the stuff you learned about a list will apply to a tuple. It's just that any of the stuff that actually modifies either elements of the list or grows or shrinks it you can't do those with tuples since they are immutable, which means they are non-modifiable. It has several advantages, but the basic reason why they're in there is there are certain situations where you have to have an immutable sequence in order to do particular things in the Python language. And we briefly looked over the Matplotlib library, which is not part of the standard Python library. So in order to use this, you would have to install it, like with a pip install, or you have to figure out how you manage and add and remove packages, whatever Python distribution that you're using. There's lots of basic plot types and more complex plot types that are part of the Matplotlib library that we didn't go over, but we did look at three fundamental ones, so line graphs, bar charts, and pie charts here. But the reason why we have that in this section is the API for most of the basic Matplotlib plotting is it takes in sequences, one or two or more sequences of items which specify the elements of the plot that you want to have drawn for you. All right, with that, that's the end of this video. As usual, I hope you guys are finding these useful. Let me know, give me feedback. If you have questions or things, make sure you shoot them to me or reach out to me or the TA for the class. Otherwise, I hope to see you in class then.